Hello and welcome to the Game Dev London podcast. My name is Anna, and on today's episode, I wanted to do a deep dive into game design pillars, what they are, how we use it, why do we need them. And today I'm joined by my co-host, Adam. Hello, Adam. How are you doing?
I'm not doing too bad. It started off raining this morning after such a lovely weekend. But it's now sun's out. Excited to record a podcast. Excited to chat to you as well. And yeah, ready to rock and roll.
Nice. Here it's kind of raining. The weekend was very nice. But let's dive in. So what are design pillars? In my experience, it's kind of like guidelines for the designers and the entire team to kind of filter what the game is or a feature and just make decisions based on it. Do you even use them in your process?
I mean, it's interesting. So often not. And the reason is not because it's not at all because I don't like them. It's just normally a lot of my development is very kind of quick. We just sort of, it's sort of game jams, a lot of pulling stuff together and just running with it. When actually, I think that they are more important than I give them credit for in terms of, having that thing to kind of to go back to. So the games we're working on at the minute, I think often we're building up to a kind of prototype stage. And I think at that point, fluidity, being dynamic and just kind of changing between different areas is crucial, where the pillars kind of need to come into play for later. But more things that I'm hearing recently, it's maybe that it's actually worth having them in from the start. So a lot of the times probably not, but probably should be using them more.
My experience mostly like in big studios with like large teams, so we usually like start with them. I guess if it's just a game jam, you don't really have time to like sit down and define it. Whereas when you're working with like a huge team, I find it very important to actually sit down and define like what are you gonna like, what is the player gonna do, what are they gonna feel to keep the experience kind of coherent.
Yeah, I think there's a thing about that, exactly that, which is the fact that it feels like there's no time in a game jam. And I think that's a big problem, especially in prototyping and early development. But exactly said, this is what the big studios know. If you don't have these kind of, these lines in the sand, these pillars, these points of reference, these monoliths, if you will, that it's very easy to lose track of what's important to the game that you're making, or to start making decisions that, while they seem, well-intentioned or useful or purposeful at the time, that actually don't work in terms of the kind of the remit or the limits of development that you've set out. And that can cause the problems very soon or later down the line. And that's why even in a game jam, actually, you can start by going, what are the things that we need to stick to? So I think it's, this is where sometimes indies can take lessons from, often indies can take lessons from big AAAs and that kind of thing. But starting by going, actually, what are the key areas of our game is an important thing to define in the first instance.
Yeah, I find it keeps the project coherent. Like, you can add so many things to your game and all of them are going to sound great, but the pillars help you understand if they're going to work together, so that you don't invest a lot of time into something that actually like doesn't work for your specific game, like adding farming to a horror game or something like that. That kind of like doesn't go together unless there is a specific purpose for it.
Mm-hmm.
And also another thing which we find it useful, like if you're I assume you like work a lot in smaller teams, right?
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm, yeah.
So like when we're working in a big team, as a designer, you kind of have your own role, and we have engineers and artists, but then like everyone on the team knows what the design pillars are, they can come to you, to the designer, with like their ideas or feedback, and they're way more relevant if they know what the goal is, and people feel way more involved in the process as well, so they can be heard and give input into the kind of like the design of the game as well.
Yeah, I think that's definitely a very good point, that pillars are they're not only are they the starting point of the game, but they are the starting point of the team. You know, you're defining what is and isn't important, and then by extension, who is and isn't in charge of that, and who makes decisions based on that, and how teams are structured around that. And when you have such a small team, you can't define those roles quite as cleanly. You know, there is in a 3 or 4 person team, there is no art department, there is no programming department. It's just that, you know, that person's the one doing it, or that person's the one searching for it online, or whatever it may be. But it's that accountability that you were sort of referring to there is still super important, because when nobody is in charge of a certain area, it's very easy either for that area to be forgotten about and sort of left to languish, and then sort of last minute go, oh, we really need to have that. As often in game jams in particular happens a lot with sound, for example. You know, you get a lot of programmers and artists, and they don't really focus on sound, and then last minute they throw something in, and it, you know, damages the overall experience of the game. Or it gets dragged into kind of decision hell, where everybody feels that they have to play a part, and everybody's like, oh, well, this is my opinion and this is my opinion, and nobody stands and goes, you know what, I'm in charge of this, and therefore I say this. And I'm not saying, you know, that we want that kind of somebody to say, I'm in charge, that's it, you know, what I say goes. But there does need to sometimes be somebody who says, I have the final say on this, and I'm saying we're going with that, just to keep things rolling forwards. And so while there's not predefined that kind of person, that department, that role, that hierarchy, it's useful to be able to, even in a small team, go, okay, I'm going to be in charge of this, you're going to be in charge of that, I'm going to be in charge of this, and I trust you to make those decisions, where even if you do make things as a group, you're able to go, this is what we're doing, I've said it, and I'm the one in charge of this kind of specific area.
Yeah, absolutely. And so like in a excuse me, and it's very important to have the pillars as well, like when you're making that decision, and you're telling the person like, oh, I'm going to be in charge in that area, you can like refer back to the objectives and be like, oh, we're not taking this part, it's cool, but there is this exact like rule or guidelines that is going to tell us what we're taking into the game and what we're not. So like in your smaller projects, how do you define, without using the pillars, then what kind of things go into the game, what kind, like how do you manage the scope of your projects?
Poorly, probably the answer. But I think exactly kind of what we're referring to there is the fact that when it's a small team, you can, and depending on how well that small team know each other, you can get away either with that one person who's kind of the project leader, if you will, the project manager, the person who kind of what they say goes, and therefore other people can kind of contribute and come up with ideas, but ultimately that person shoulders the responsibility of saying yes and no to things. And then you are reliant on that person having a good sense of scope and scope creep and preventing things getting sort of out of hand. And that can be a good thing or a bad thing depending on the person. You know, if that person is a producer or has a mind for like long form game development, then you're probably in good hands. If that person has not really made a lot of games before, or has their specific area but gets easily distracted, then it's very, very quickly that game can lose, you know, all sense of scope and slickness, because they just want to add features and they just want to add stuff. The other way of doing it is that in my company, where there's 3 of us are the kind of co-founders, and we have a slightly large team than that now, but the 3 of us kind of make decisions as a group, and we are very lucky for 2 reasons. One, we've been working with each other for such a long time, we're generally aligned on things, whilst also having a lot of experience with game development. But because there are 3 of us, there can only ever be a majority. You know, unless we're in a weird situation where we've got 3 decisions. Generally speaking, it's 2 versus 1. And in that situation, you just have to trust the people that you're with, that they have the best intentions in mind, and also that at some point you will also be on the winning side of that 2 versus 1 majority, and that ultimately, you know, unless there's some kind of fundamental reason why you think something won't work, and you have to stand your ground, that even in those circumstances, that you trust, if you do have to do that, that the other people will believe in you and trust you and work with you. And ultimately, it comes down to that kind of trust thing, which is trust is great for small teams, agile teams, people who know each other, not great for big teams or teams that don't know each other, because you can't, it's difficult to have that intrinsic level of trust between each other to know that decisions are being made in the best interest, not only of the game, but also bearing in mind your personal opinion as well. And so for us, we get away with the fact that we have trust, but certainly in game jams, for example, when I'm working with people that I don't know, I often take on the role of that kind of project manager, creative director, if you will, kind of position, trying to bring in the opinions of everyone in my team, because people can bring diverse and interesting opinions, but with a mindful of the fact that sometimes decisions just have to be made, and something people can get really excited about things that just aren't going to work, go out of scope. Exactly like your example. If you're making a horror game and the artist or another programmer comes in and says, "Oh, but in this bit we should have a farming mini game," you do have to have somebody who can say, "No, we're not going to do that," because if everybody just goes, "Oh yeah, let's do it," your game goes completely wild and out of focus before. And I've been there. We did a game once. It came off the back of Game Jam. We carried on developing it. We took it to EGX to showcase it, and we wrote down every piece of feedback that we got. Every single piece we wrote it down, because we thought that people playing it would know what needed to change, what needed to adapt. And without really doing a lot of analysis of the feedback we'd given, we tried to just kind of implement all of it. We kind of just go, yeah, we'll do that. And what we ended up with was a hot mess of a game with like waves and King of the Hill and top down, but also with an angle. And it was just a mess, absolute mess. Because people often can get really excited about their own personal ideas and not necessarily have in mind the scope of what they're working on, the limitations of cost or time or budget or ability or capability or anything. And you need that kind of either collective spirit or individual spirit who can say, this isn't going to work. So to answer your question, we get away with that on trust and the ability and the fact that we know each other very well, that we can kind of be that kind of scoping or limiting scoping person for each other. But I think it can be very difficult, especially for new teams.
Yeah, but like, even though you're saying you don't have any pillars, you trust each other, but each one of you has like a vision, right? So like you do inform your decision somehow, and that's essentially what the pillars are, but just like not written down. So like, how do you personally decide which decision is the correct one and which one isn't?
Yeah, and you're right. And this is where one of the bigger problems comes in with not having defined pillars, is that you as an individual, or me in this case, me as an individual, certainly have kind of a mindset of what the kind of game I'm trying to build. And you don't, even if you don't consciously realize it, you're kind of hoping or expecting or assuming that everybody else has the exact same vision as you. And it's just not, often it's not the case. And so for me, and normally it comes from early in the stage of development, I'll have a think about what I believe this game to be. What is the game trying to do? What is it trying to say? How do I want players to play it? What do I want them to take away from the experience? What is important to this game, and defining those kind of key areas kind of form my kind of internal pillars, as it were. And I try to answer all questions that come up in development in relation to those kind of pillars. So to take Global Game, the game we made for Global Game Jam as an example, the key pillars for me were kind of the visual aesthetic of the game, making it look great, this kind of sense of duality, because that was the theme, between the two sides of my game. Sort of my game was based on a cube, so there's two sides kind of in competition with each other. And having that duality run throughout the game, and leading into it being a worthwhile experience for the player. Now, those seem like really good pillars. I mean, it sounds like you've got a core, you've got this idea, you know what you're doing. Notice that none of those pillars were gameplay. And it showed. The game was okay to play. It was not as fun as I was just like, it'll be fine. It'll be all right. Whereas if I'd gone back to the start and really stood there and gone, what are the pillars of our game? One of them should have been gameplay, 100%. And then decisions should have been made throughout development around making the gameplay whatever it was that we wanted. It could have been fun, it could have been interesting, it could have been creative, it could have been anything. But because there was nothing, it got left behind. And so the feedback that I got from people playing the game afterwards were, looks great, one of the pillars, really interesting use of the theme, one of the ideas, not that fun because I missed it. And that's a really important part. A big problem with internalized pillars is that if you don't vocalize it and talk to people and get opinions, you can miss really big obvious things.
Yeah, so basically you did have pillars, but just in your head. You did meet them though, so that's a good sign. But yeah, I do feel also it's important to write them down. When I'm making my own projects, like I usually create like a pillar for each category, like how does it look, how does it feel. I think like one of the processes that we learned when I just joined the industry, which I thought was brilliant, we got like an entire team to just write down the actions and then write down the feelings. So
Yep.
like, what does a player do? How do they feel? And the third one was like the overall experience. And then you as a team match them up. So you have like all of the areas covered. You have the actions, you have what the player does, you have the feelings, you have like the overall atmosphere, the theme, all of it. And it's kind of like within each pillar you would have all of the components of the game, and you would be trying to kind of like create the experience that matches that pillar at all times.
Absolutely.
And not getting lost.
Yeah, no, I think emotion is a really good way of starting, especially if you're first starting of your game and you're trying to think of how do we define a pillar for this? What's it going to be? How would we even start that? Emotion is a fantastic starting point because ultimately that is one of the things you're trying to get the person at the other end of the end to do, is to feel something, anything, right? Because if they play your game and they feel nothing, then it's not a great experience. It's like, okay, great. You think about your favorite TV shows, right? If you put on a TV show and felt nothing, no emotional reaction, you turn it off because it's a waste of your time. So starting with, okay, exactly like you said, start with each area with the gameplay. How do we want the player to feel? Do we want them to be delighted? Do we want them to be surprised? Do we want them to be scared? Do we want them to be joyful? What is it that we want people to feel in that moment? It's a great way of kind of setting up your initial kind of pillars, and then being able to bounce off them and go, if your goal is to make the player feel scared and someone comes along and says, I want this bounce to feel really juicy, you're like, is that gonna terrify anyone? Is anyone gonna go, if our scary game has got this great bouncing that feels so light and happy, does that completely undermine what we're trying to do here? Really good. It's a really good starting point.
Yeah, and like the bouncing might be amazing, but then you have like this specific rule of like this just does not fit the theme, and then no one feels offended or anything like that.
Mm-hmm.
So how, like you were talking about defined vision, which for me, even though you don't call it pillars, it's still a pillar. It's just like the case of like writing them down and not writing them down. So what's your process of defining what the vision is? Like, where do you get inspiration for like all those like feely, touchy things in the game?
So it's interesting is that for me, I try to kind of stay aware of things that interest me at all times. And so I go on sort of open places like obviously Twitter, Reddit and Instagram and all these, go out into the world. I read, watch films and TV, all this kind of stuff, and keep an eye out for things that I think particularly interesting, because you don't know what your next game is going to be, and you don't know when you make it what aesthetic or aspect or thing you're going to care about. So for example, going into Global Game Jam, I knew that I wanted to make a game that had kind of an emotional driver at the core of it, that made the player feel something. And that drove a lot of my decision making, and it drove it away from gameplay, but it did drive it through this interesting place where we made this game about the kind of the issues of trade between two different sides of these groups and how they work together. And the goal was to kind of make the player feel for this character who was kind of caught between two sides of this kind of trade war, essentially. And it came from. I think it came from the real world. There's a lot of issues around trade at the minute, and people discussing the implications of trade. And I think that definitely sort of drove the decision making. I thought it was a great narrative point of view, that it's somewhere to connect with the player and make them feel something outside of, a lot of games go just joyful or happy and that's it. That's the driver, which is fine. It's absolutely not a problem. But I think games have the power to do some really interesting things in that space. And certainly my favorite games don't just go for joyful and that's it. They go for other emotions as well. And so I was trying to build something with that in mind. And in terms of the game, in terms of the narrative, I think we did that. But obviously, my mistake was sacrificing gameplay for that. But yeah, I think it's easy. I think it's easy for people to just draw inspiration just from games. But the problem with that is that if you only draw from places that you've been before, then the things you're going to make are going to be very similar. That's not to say you can't take stuff from other games. Absolutely do. Think about the games that give you the kind of sense of, like you said, the little bits of what you want to do. Like if you want to do a really interesting world, is it going to be more Breath of the Wild? Is it going to be more Odyssey? Is it going to be more Elden Ring? What kind of world do you want to build? You can draw from those experiences and learn about it. But also, if you were doing an open world game, there's a lot of open worlds out there, written in books, in films. You go out into the local park and see how they've decorated it. There's lots of ways of creating the same thing, and find the ones that are closest to what you want to do, but also allow you to kind of draw from other places to do something new and interesting.
Yeah, absolutely. Like for me as well, drawing from different media and just from outside world. Like I wanted to create like a hiking game and to draw inspiration and create like my objectives and stuff. I just went on a hike and was kind of recording everything that I was feeling. Think like it's an interesting idea to try to recreate a real world feelings into a game.
Oh, yeah, massively.
If you set it as an objective, you can then like tailor your mechanics, your aesthetics, your story to do that as well.
Mm-hmm.
But we've been talking about the like vision and pillars of the entire game, but in my opinion, we also set the objectives like per feature to make sure that it's like it does something. Do you ever do that? Like, how do you start a feature? Do you have like a specific objectives to implement, like so it fits with the system, or do you just roll with it?
It kind of depends on the game. So to take a game to go back to that example that I made before about the game that failed, the one where we added too many things and it just became a mess. When that happened, I kind of wanted to go, okay, we've done this game was good at some point. We took it to EGX, people enjoyed it. What was it about the game that people enjoyed? And we drilled down into it, and for us in the game, it was this kind of slightly rhythm-based wave shooter where you had kind of like a physics-based weapon that kind of pushed enemies back. And the way it worked was that if you pushed them back with enough force, they would kind of fling off you and smash into a wall and be destroyed. And we had a 2-player mode that allowed you to compete against each other, but also to smash your opponent into the wall as well. And people love that. People love going to a friend and kind of using physics to kind of smash them into a wall. And these are just sort of top-down 2D characters. But we took that feeling so in this case, the feeling was it was playful, it was joyful, it was free. There was no limits on when you did it. You just kind of had this freedom mechanic, and it was competitive. You were doing it against somebody else, and we took that out and said, people love this. How do we make that as a game and nothing else? And that led to the development of our next game, which we're still working on, which is called Robo Basho, which is like a robot sumo fighting game. And we started, our first prototype was a top-down 2D game where you had a physics-based character who sort of moved around a ring and a dash. And that's all it was. So you could dash and knock into somebody and try and knock them off the arena. And we took that to an event and people really enjoyed it. People really liked that game. And even though it was really just these two mechanics, you move and you dash and that's it, people still enjoyed it because we'd found, like you said, for this mechanic, we'd found the pillars that worked for people, which was to make it fun, make it free in terms of physics, and make it competitive. And by just sticking to that and having something, the absolutely simplest form of that, we still had something fun. And actually, we didn't need all this extra stuff, these, the wave shoot. In this case, we didn't need the wave shoot or the rhythm based or the King of the Hill, the map or anything. If we just had that, it was still a fun game. And so we then built an even better game off the back of that, which we're still working on to this day.
Yeah, so it sounds like a little bit of a backwards process. You made a game and then you defined
yeah. I don't recommend that for everyone.
Yeah, I do that as well all the time. But no, this is interesting because like if you did define the pillars at the very start, you wouldn't have even invested all the time because every time you start making something, you would ask a question like, is it does it have that core that we want to create, kind of thing. So how do you we use pillars to also define if a feature of a game is successful. Like they don't have to be emotional. They could be like, oh, it's drives engagement or players interact with that feature more, kind of thing. So how, and we used it to define like if we made something successful, how do you define what the successful feature is in your games?
Yeah, so success is an interesting one because very often people just default to monetary and go, if we make X amount or Y amount or this many people play it, then that's success, and that's fine. That's absolutely fine as a goal, but it's restrictive in terms of to do that, there are very key things that you have to do. And I think a lot of people, they slap that on as a goal and then don't think about it. When actually the whole point of all of your goals and targets are to drive your decision making. So if your goal is to have, 1 million players or 1 million owners, then you have to make a game that 1 million people would buy. You can't make something super niche and interesting that's like for a specific group of people if your goal is to have 1 million players. Those two goals, that pillar and that strategy are not aligned. So you have to think about what does success look like for you in that instance. Often for us, it's just about making, for us, it's never normally particularly big goals. It's more about trying to just define a small area in which we want to be successful. So for us, that could be, we made someone happy, or we made a lot of people happy, or we made 10 people happy. It doesn't really matter that much. For RoboBash, so for Antiphase, which was the one we took to EGX, we didn't really define what that was. We just kind of did it and was just like, we'll see. But I think for RoboBash, we're gonna have to define goals like we want. Trying to think what's a good one. For example, probably be for us, it'll be something like a review score. And the reason for that is because that doesn't limit the number of players that we have to have. We're not going to say, we've got to have 1 million players, because that changes how we're building the game. Now it's got to be a game that 1 million people would want to own. And if it's not, then we're going to hit a problem. So it would be probably something like have a 85% score on Metacritic, for example, because that way that aligns with our goals of being a good game that people like and is enjoyable and is well reviewed, which is a totally different set of goals, but does mean that we're then focused in what we're doing and making sure we're like, is this something that, it's a bit vague because it's like, well, is this an 85% rated feature? Who knows? But it does mean that it gives us a quality bar that we have to adapt to. And that if we're coming in under that quality bar, if we're going, this thing, this gameplay, this feature, how this feels is not, that level of quality, the kind of quality that someone would play and go, yeah, this is really good, then we know we've got a problem.
Yeah. And things like Metacritic, I think, are very useful, because that kind of speaks to the quality of the feature rather than number of players. Because if your goal is to get a specific number of players, then you're going to make a game that sounds very interesting but not fun to play, because you don't care if they stay. You just care who you acquire, kind of thing. Absolutely.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm.
Which kind of brings me like, what would you say is a good goal? Because like, with any kind of goals, like even personal job goals, same as game and feature goals, what for you is a good one? What is a well-defined and what is a bad one?
As with a lot of things that are like defined points, for me, the key here is I generally tend to use smart targets, which basically align to is it sensible? Is it? I think it's sensible. Sensible, yeah, sensible, measurable, achievable. I always forget the R and the TR. I'm definitely not looking them up in the background. Is it reachable? I'm going to say relevant. That's the one. Is it specific, measurable, attainable, relevant, time based? I definitely didn't Google that. Where basically what we're talking about here is the fact that if your goals are not just statements that exist, if you just say, I want to do this, I want to do that, great. The problem is that they hold no accountability, they hold no intention, they hold no direction, they hold no way for you to actually know that you've done it. And that's a problem. The difference between I want to be rich and I want to have £1 million in my bank account by the end of this year is being rich is such a vague statement. Saying I want to have £1 million by the end of this year gives you a point in time at which you're measuring against. It gives you an amount of which you're doing. It's still not a perfect goal, but it's a much easier goal to imagine, to work backwards from and figure out how you get there than anything else. So for me, creating goals for using smart targets, being specific about what you're trying to achieve, how you're going to measure it. Is it something that's actually even feasible? There's no point saying I want to make a game, an MMORPG with 6 people, because you could sit there going, can you actually do that? Is that going to be possible in any kind of reasonable time? Is important, relevant to what you're doing. Don't start setting goals that don't really help you or help your game. And time-based, because a goal with no end is not a goal. It sounds like a goal, but I want to be rich with no time frame doesn't mean anything. What does that mean? Does that mean by the end of your life you've made X amount? Great, good for you. Having it say time based within 6 months, a year, 2 years, whatever, just gives it that scope that means it actually might happen, as opposed to we'll get to it when we get to it.
Yeah, that's how a lot of projects that you never finish are created.
Absolutely. Oh, I have a lot of those.
Yeah, same. I'm kind of like, the relevant, I think, is the most important, especially like if you're combining a lot of them specifically for a game or like a feature. Like if you have a lot of goals that don't align between each other, that also doesn't kind of work.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think this goes back to our point before about if you're not stating your goals, if you're not stating your pillars, if you're not talking to a team about it, the problem is that you can really quickly get on misaligned goals. And misaligned goals can lead people off in very different directions and in ways that you don't expect. And it'll only be when you come back together and do talk about it in the form of this feature that someone's been developing for 6 months, and then they go, right, I'm going to integrate it into the game, and you go, this has got nothing to do with the game that I'm making. And you're like, but this is the game that I'm making, that you can hit these huge problems and really big, like discussions about what the purpose of it is. Whereas if right at the beginning you have open communication, talk about the plan, what you're doing, etc., you can avoid those problems by just being open and communicative about what your goals and what you're trying to do.
Yeah, absolutely. And the takeaway, like, we all actually do use objectives and game pillars, but just don't write them down, which is very important, especially if you're working in a team. Yeah,
absolutely.
So I think for a first part of this episode, I think like we defined pretty well what the game pillars are, why we use them, why they're important. I do recommend you use them in your projects. They're very, very good. Thanks everyone for joining us on the Game Dev London podcast. To find out more, please go to gamedevlondon.co.uk or otherwise see you next week. Bye.
Bye-bye.